The judge falls ill in court during an important trial, but a young lawyer acts quickly, saves the judge, and the revelation after the incident changes her destiny forever. The courtroom was packed, filled with a mix of curiosity and tension. People squeezed in, trying to find a spot, exchanging nervous whispers and anxious glances while waiting for the trial to begin. At the center of all the anticipation, seated in his position of authority, was Judge Richard Hastings, known for his rigor and unwavering impartiality. He surveyed the room with a serious expression, his sharp eyes scanning every corner as if they could detect any attempt at deception before it was even spoken. The tension seemed to vibrate in the air. The audience was made up of influential figures, eager journalists, and involved family members, all watching each move intently. The room's lighting was intense, casting shadows and highlighting the austerity of the place. Every detail seemed meticulously designed to evoke respect, from the dark wooden benches to the heavy emblem mounted on the wall behind the judge. The silence was only broken by the soft clicks of cameras and muffled murmurs carrying the significance of what was about to happen. Sitting a few feet from the judge was Chloe Reynolds, a young lawyer who, despite her youth, exuded a rare confidence. She arranged the papers on the table with steady movements, unhurried, as if every detail of her preparation was part of a carefully rehearsed ritual. Chloe took a deep breath, feeling the weight of expectations on her shoulders but determined not to let it shake her. Her eyes shone with a mix of tension and excitement, ready for what would be her first major trial. Chloe exuded a blend of nerves and grit that caught the eyes of some in attendance. Although she was young, her movements reflected a seriousness that set her apart from others. Her hair was tied back in an elegant bun, revealing a focused expression, and her dark, immaculate attire only emphasized her determination. Chloe knew that many might underestimate her because of her age or lack of experience, but for her, this trial was more than just a legal dispute. It was a chance to prove herself. In the distance, she could hear some discreet comments among the other lawyers. "Who is she?" one of the veterans asked with a skeptical air, casting a sidelong glance in her direction. "I heard she's promising, but let's see if she can handle the pressure," commented another, more intrigued than critical. Chloe paid no attention. She knew people would talk, but today she wouldn't let herself be distracted. Today she was there to fight for justice, and, secretly, to impress the man who was about to preside over the trial. The case at hand was complex, full of nuances that would challenge even the most experienced professionals. Chloe mentally reviewed the arguments she had prepared, aware that Judge Hastings would be relentless in his questioning. His reputation as an incisive judge was well known, and every word he spoke in court seemed to carry the weight of a hammer that only knew the truth. Chloe adjusted her posture, aware that any slip would be noticed, but determined to face each obstacle head-on. When Judge Hastings finally struck the gavel, signaling the start of the session, a profound silence fell over the room. All eyes turned to him, awaiting the first instruction, but Chloe felt as if an invisible thread connected the judge's gaze to her own. Not entirely understanding why, she felt a small spark of pride realizing that this admirable man would be the one to decide the fate of her case. With a slight nod, almost imperceptible, she showed she was ready, her eyes fixed on the imposing figure dominating the room. As the proceedings began, the courtroom turned into a scene of tension and anticipation. Every word echoed with an almost theatrical precision. Chloe responded firmly to the initial questions, her voice clear and controlled, not allowing anxiety to take over. She noticed that the judge was watching her intently, his critical gaze evaluating each response, each reaction. He wasn't the kind of man who gave any clues, but Chloe knew she was being tested, and that only strengthened her resolve. At the end of the first testimony, Chloe remained alert, mentally reviewing each detail discussed. She knew there was still a long way to go, but she felt strangely confident. The environment seemed to conspire for that moment, where every held breath and every glance were like intertwined threads sustaining the weight of the court. And as Judge Hastings announced a recess before the next session, Chloe took a deep breath, aware that her first big test was just beginning. Chloe felt a silent admiration for Judge Hastings, a figure who represented everything she always aspired to be: respectable, unwavering, and just. Since she began her career, she had heard stories about his rigor, his ability to separate emotion from reason, and his relentless pursuit of the truth. She saw in him a mirror of what she wanted to achieve and wondered, silently, if she would ever inspire the same reverence in others. Hastings was, in many ways, a living example of integrity, something rare in the legal world, and that fascinated her the most. Every word he uttered in court seemed meticulously chosen, as if it carried a precise and necessary weight for justice. Chloe watched the way he commanded the room, his presence dominating the environment effortlessly, with just a glance or a slight change in tone. For her, it was a form of art, and her admiration went beyond professionalism. It was a deep, almost personal aspiration to one day be worthy of a similar stance. Unconsciously, she studied each of his gestures, as if she were learning a unique lesson on authority and morality. The audience, perhaps oblivious to the details, also seemed to capture something special in the way Chloe looked at the judge. There was something in her posture, maybe a silent respect, a sparkle in her eyes following each of Judge Hastings' movements, that captivated others. Some whispered among themselves, noting that the young lawyer seemed somewhat fascinated, perhaps inspired, by the one who would be her role model. Without realizing it, her admiration was taking on a presence of its own, almost like an aura, creating an invisible bond between her and Hastings that was reflected in Chloe's serious and dedicated expression. Internally, Chloe reflected on how Hastings represented for her not just a challenge but a goal. He was an uncompromising jurist, someone who wasn't swayed by external pressures or personal influences, something she herself had committed to following in choosing her profession. Hastings was the embodiment of everything the law should be, a balance between power and the responsibility to use it justly. For Chloe, just being in his presence was an honor, and she wouldn't miss any opportunity to learn, absorb, and understand the essence of what he was. Even when he made long, strategic pauses, the silence seemed to transform into something almost tangible. Chloe watched, fascinated, as he used each pause to allow those present to absorb the weight of his words. She tried to read between the lines, seeking to understand the almost magical technique that turned those pauses into part of his speech. For Chloe, it was more than a strategy. It was proof of confidence in one's own knowledge, something she hoped to one day possess to the same degree. As the trial progressed, Chloe realized there was much more to Judge Hastings than his reputation or professional achievements. There was a hidden humanity in him, a certain weariness in his gaze, as if a lifetime dedicated to justice had marked him indelibly. As Chloe continued to observe Hastings throughout the trial, she began to discern traces of someone who carried a burden greater than he showed. She sensed that understanding this side of the judge was part of her own learning process. The other lawyers and assistants seemed to feel the same aura of respect that emanated between Chloe and the judge, though few could explain precisely what emotionally connected them. Some watched her with curiosity, as if trying to understand why she looked at the judge with such fascination. The more experienced lawyers might have sensed that this wasn't merely respect but genuine admiration, born from an ideal that transcended the typical logic of the courtroom. Chloe seemed to view him almost as a mythical figure, and that did not go unnoticed. And as time passed, Chloe remained mesmerized by Hastings, engrossed in every detail, every line on his face, as if answers to her own questions and dilemmas were hidden there. It was a subtle yet powerful connection, and at the same time, it was imbued with an almost innocent desire to one day be worthy of someone like him. This respect, this inspiration, filled Chloe with a sense of purpose and pride. She felt strengthened, as if her presence alongside Hastings was more than a privilege. It was an invitation to walk towards a future marked by integrity and truth. With the sound of Hastings' gavel once again, Chloe snapped back to the case at hand. She knew this was only the beginning, and that to earn the respect of the judge in the courtroom, she had to prove not only her knowledge but her character. The tension in the courtroom was palpable, almost suffocating. The air seemed heavy with the held breaths of the dozens awaiting Judge Hastings' decision. Each minute felt like an eternity as lawyers exchanged cautious glances and the jurors observed everything with closed expressions. It was a delicate trial, where deep moral questions intertwined with powerful interests testing values. Even the slightest murmur echoed off the walls, reinforcing the oppressive atmosphere that dominated the hall. Seated in his central position, Judge Hastings reviewed the final documents with a calm that contrasted with the general unease. His upright posture and deep gaze made it clear he would not be swayed by external pressures. But Chloe, familiar with his firm countenance, detected a slight tension in his expression. Something in his eyes reflected the weight of the case he held. She knew Hastings understood the complexity of the situation. The choices he made here would have repercussions far beyond that courtroom. The jurors, aligned solemnly, exchanged quick glances, as if trying to assess the impact the decision would have on the lives of those involved. The judge's words, still unsaid, held the power to alter destinies. The case at hand was not merely a legal dispute. It was a clash between two worlds, each defending its own concept of right and wrong. There was something profoundly human in the dispute, and that was exactly what made the wait so agonizing. Everyone there knew that the outcome would bring consequences that could not be undone. On the defense side, the lawyers whispered among themselves, arranging papers and reviewing arguments, but with an expression of concern that betrayed the weight of the situation. Even the most seasoned seemed apprehensive, knowing that any detail could change the trial's outcome. Chloe, observing from her seat, felt the impact of that pressure in every gesture, every sigh. The arguments were complex, and she found herself mentally revisiting the case's facts, trying to anticipate each point that might be questioned. On the opposite side, the prosecution maintained a posture of confidence, but its lawyers refrained from celebrating any premature advantage. Every word spoken thus far had been carefully chosen, as if each sentence bore an almost spiritual responsibility. Chloe noticed the tension in the lead prosecutor's eyes, avoiding direct eye contact with the judge, perhaps fearing that any sign of insecurity could compromise his credibility. Both sides seemed frozen between certainty and doubt, awaiting an outcome no one could predict. The spectators, for the most part, remained in absolute silence, their eyes glued to the main figures of the trial. Some leaned forward, as if the slightest movement could reveal the long-awaited decision. Among the audience were family members, friends of those involved, and even people with no direct connection to the case but who had come seeking answers to their own conflicts. For many, this trial was a living lesson in morality, a duel of principles that touched their very souls. Chloe maintained a serious expression but struggled internally to stay calm. She knew she was facing a pivotal moment, where any misstep could shatter her client's hopes. She took a deep breath, trying to control her nerves. It wasn't just the verdict that was at stake here, it was also the integrity of her own performance. The weight of responsibility was overwhelming, knowing that any detail could mean the difference between justice and injustice. Judge Hastings watched the room like a guardian of the law, someone who seemed to carry not only duty but a personal commitment to the truth. Each second of silence added a new layer of tension, as if the walls of that courtroom absorbed the anticipation of the dozens of people present. Chloe watched his impassive expression, trying to read something in his face, but without success. Hastings seemed like a statue, untouched by the pressure that affected the others, a true master at concealing any sign of hesitation. Finally, Hastings raised his hand, silencing even the faintest whispers. It was a signal that his next words could change everything. Chloe felt her heart race, her eyes fixed on the imposing figure of the judge, waiting, like everyone else, for the words that would seal the case's fate. In that instant, everyone in the courtroom seemed to hold their breath, unable to look away from the central figure. The silence was absolute, as if everyone knew that something momentous was about to happen. The courtroom was in total silence, all eyes on Judge Hastings, anxiously awaiting his next words. Hastings paused, placing a hand on his chest with a slight gasp, as if gathering the strength to announce his decision. But instead of delivering the awaited verdict, his body swayed and he stumbled backward, his fingers losing their grip on the gavel, which fell with a dull thud. A gasp of shock rippled through the crowd as the judge slumped heavily into his chair, his face suddenly pale. For a moment, no one knew what to do. The jurors exchanged panicked looks, and the lawyers froze in their places, unable to believe what they were seeing. Hastings' face, once serene and firm, was now contorted in pain. The figure that represented strength and justice had suddenly become vulnerable in front of everyone. It was as if the ground had been pulled out from under each person present, leaving them suspended in disbelief and fear. A murmur broke out in the hall, mixing confusion and concern as some stood from their seats, hesitant, unsure if they should intervene. "Someone help. Call an ambulance," a voice shouted, breaking the inertia that had dominated the scene. But the chaos was such that even the security officers seemed stunned, trapped in a state of paralysis. The spectators, once so attentive and silent, now became a restless mass, their expressions mirroring the desperation of seeing the judge in such a state. The situation seemed almost unreal, as if time itself had slowed. Among those present, some were still trying to process what was happening, while others already displayed expressions of panic. An elderly lady in the front row raised her hands to her mouth, her eyes wide with horror, while a young man in the back row closed his eyes, unable to face what he was witnessing. It was as if the courtroom was collapsing before them, the symbol of order disintegrating amidst the collective despair. Richard Hastings, the imposing judge who had always been unshakable, was now defenseless, casting a shadow of vulnerability over everyone. Chloe, who had been observing everything from her place, felt a rush of adrenaline course through her body. Around her, the commotion intensified as unfamiliar faces merged into a blurred mass of fear and confusion. But something in Hastings' posture struck her deeply. A mix of admiration and compassion made her see more than just a judge. There was a human being fighting against something unseen. Among the rows and corridors, some tried in vain to call for help, but the situation was so chaotic that calls were lost in the rush. The hall, once governed by Hastings' steady voice, was now engulfed in chaos, voices blending into frantic cries and desperate murmurs. Those watching, gripped by a sense of helplessness, observed the scene without reaction. Chloe felt her heart racing, thinking that this was the most terrifying moment she could ever witness. There was something haunting about the figure of the judge who, even fallen, seemed to emit a silent strength. He was unconscious but still there, like a rock in the middle of a storm. Chloe couldn't take her eyes off him, her mind swirling with thoughts, trying to grasp the gravity of the situation. Around her, the sounds of hurried footsteps and echoing voices grew louder, but to her, everything had become a blur, except for the image of Hastings collapsed. Those who knew him exchanged looks of sadness and disbelief, unable to process the fall of such a steadfast figure. "He seemed fine this morning," someone murmured, while others cast uncertain glances, trying to understand what could have caused this. Judge Hastings, who had never faltered in delivering a sentence, now seemed betrayed by his own body, and this sight brought to the surface a fragility that everyone carried but rarely revealed so brutally. The courtroom, which had always been a symbol of stability and order, had now transformed into a scene of uncertainty and fear. Each person there seemed to confront their own mortality, their own limits, in the face of the judge's collapse. Chloe felt the weight of this reality pressing down on her, a mix of vulnerability and responsibility, as if called to act somehow. Without hesitation, Chloe pushed through the barrier of people that had formed around the judge. With determined steps, she moved through the confused and anxious gazes of those present, feeling her pulse pounding in her veins. The young lawyer did not think twice. She knelt beside Hastings, placing one hand on his shoulder while the other searched for signs of a pulse. She felt his labored, irregular breathing, as if something within him was breaking down. She knew she couldn't waste a single second. A murmur of surprise rippled through the audience as Chloe, in an unexpected move, gently tilted Hastings' head back, clearing his airway. She quickly assessed his condition, her trained eyes analyzing each detail as if she had done it many times before. "He's struggling to breathe," she murmured to herself, though her voice was audible enough to silence the questions around her. The crowd watched in shock, stunned to see a lawyer assuming the role of rescuer with such precision. Chloe took off her jacket, folded it, and placed it under the judge's head for support. With steady hands, she began to check his pulse and vital signs, her mind guided by first aid training that directed each movement. It was as if she had been transported into a role few would have imagined she would play. Each touch, each movement, was careful but determined, and the audience watched in an almost reverent silence, as if she were the only hope in the midst of chaos. Among the audience, incredulous faces whispered confused remarks. "She's a lawyer, not a doctor," someone murmured, trying to make sense of the scene. Others exchanged glances, unsure where such skill came from. Chloe ignored the looks. Her thoughts were entirely focused on Hastings and the urgent need to stabilize him until help arrived. Her hands did not tremble. Her face remained calm as she applied basic stabilization techniques, adjusting the judge's head and observing his signs with absolute concentration. Sensing that his pulse was weakening, Chloe began chest compressions, maintaining the rhythm with precision. She counted each compression mentally without losing control, without hesitating. Her previous experience with first aid, a skill she had never mentioned to anyone in the court, now proved vital. Each second was precious, and Chloe knew she couldn't afford a single mistake. The audience watched, eyes wide, while the noise of security officers' footsteps and other lawyers seemed distant, muffled by the intensity of the moment. Gradually, the judge's breathing began to show signs of improvement, still weak but steady. Chloe kept control, monitoring every small sign of recovery, her face concentrated and attentive. Without words, her presence was like a pillar of calm amid the general panic. Those who had previously seen her as a determined young lawyer now saw a woman whose courage and competence went beyond the expected, transforming a moment of despair into a real chance of survival. Judge Hastings coughed slightly, his breathing stabilizing under Chloe's care. Her eyes never left him for a second, and her face showed a mixture of relief and concentration. The murmurs around faded into a silence of respect, as if everyone understood they were witnessing something extraordinary. She remained by Hastings' side, like a silent guardian, determined to keep him stable until the paramedics arrived. Finally, the courtroom doors burst open, and the paramedics entered, their expressions reflecting the urgency of the situation. Chloe made room for them but didn't fully step away, quickly explaining what she had done and the state in which she had found the judge. Her voice was clear and precise, relaying every necessary detail to the paramedics, while the others watched, still incredulous at what had just happened. For many, Chloe had just revealed a side no one knew existed. As the paramedics began to transfer the judge onto a stretcher, Chloe stepped back, finally feeling the weight of what she had just done. The gazes directed at her varied from respect to admiration, as if the courtroom, a space dedicated to justice and duty, had found a new kind of heroism in her presence. She took a deep breath, still feeling the adrenaline coursing through her veins, but her expression remained calm. In that instant of courage and surprise, Chloe had turned the courtroom into a stage for her own act of bravery, marked in the memory of all who witnessed her feat. The sound of the ambulance siren echoed through the courtroom, an urgent sound that heightened the anxiety on the faces of those present. The paramedics cleared a path through the crowded corridor, the whispering voices and anxious looks of spectators following their every step. Chloe stayed close to the judge, watching intently as the medical team carefully placed him on the stretcher. She felt a deep responsibility toward Hastings, as if she couldn't leave him until she was sure he was safe. As the paramedics prepared to take the judge away, some people around began murmuring questions, curious and confused. How did she know what to do? Someone whispered in disbelief, casting intrigued glances at Chloe. Others shook their heads, impressed by the calm and precision with which she had acted. Chloe, though aware of the looks, remained focused, her face still reflecting the determination and concern that drove her actions. When the paramedics started to move the stretcher toward the exit, Chloe took a step forward, without hesitation. "I'll go with him," she announced, her voice firm, an anchor amid the agitation around her. Her decision took everyone by surprise, including the security officers, who hesitated for a brief moment before letting her proceed. The courtroom, where Chloe had once been just a determined lawyer, now saw her as an enigmatic figure willing to go beyond any limit for that man. The admiring and surprised looks continued as she followed the team to the ambulance. "Why is she so involved?" a man muttered quietly, exchanging glances with the woman next to him. To the other lawyers present, her actions were rare, and even unexpected, for a professional who was supposed to maintain composure. However, for Chloe, the choice to accompany Hastings felt more natural than any other decision she had ever made. Inside the ambulance, Chloe stayed by the judge's side, watching each procedure performed by the paramedics, her eyes vigilant for any change in his condition. The vehicle swayed slightly, but she remained steady, her attention undivided. Despite not knowing him personally, she felt an unusual responsibility for him, as if a silent connection was beginning to form, something she couldn't explain, but which compelled her not to leave him alone. The journey to the hospital was brief but filled with tension. Chloe kept her hands pressed against her sides, trying to control the anxiety that was beginning to build up in her chest. As the paramedics continued to monitor the judge, she silently prayed that he would overcome this crisis. She felt so involved that it was as if Hastings' fate was somehow intertwined with her own. When they arrived, the medical team rushed to take him out of the ambulance, and Chloe followed them without hesitation, even though she wasn't sure if she could accompany him all the way. As they crossed the hospital corridors, whispers resumed, this time coming from the medical staff and nurses. "Is she family?" one of them asked another, casting a curious glance in Chloe's direction as she walked beside the stretcher. She had no answers for these questions. She didn't understand why she felt so connected to the judge. But in light of Hastings' condition, nothing seemed more important than ensuring he was safe. Finally, the team took Hastings into a treatment room, and Chloe was forced to wait outside. She took a deep breath, feeling the adrenaline slowly give way to exhaustion and uncertainty. Her gaze drifted for a moment to the cold, white walls of the hospital as she tried to understand the complexity of this impulse to protect him. Something inside her still beat strongly, an inexplicable unease, as if this moment was only the beginning of a long journey. Chloe sat in one of the waiting chairs, her hands still trembling, though her face showed calm. The few minutes she spent beside the judge had changed something inside her, although she didn't yet know exactly what. The hospital environment was cold and impersonal, the characteristic smell of disinfectant hanging in the air. Chloe waited outside the room where Hastings had been taken, sitting in an uncomfortable blue plastic chair. She tried to stay calm, but the weight made her breathing slow and heavy. Her gaze was lost on the floor, the recent images of the judge collapsing in court still vivid in her mind. Amid the tension, fragments of her childhood began to surface, distant memories that, until then, seemed irrelevant but now emerged with disturbing clarity. Her heart tightened as she recalled the blurry figure of a man in her memory, someone she knew only in brief scenes, like images from an old dream. There was something familiar about Hastings, something she couldn't explain but that seemed to resonate with these memories. She remembered a distant laugh, strong hands lifting her into the air, and a scent that now seemed close to Hastings' smell, as if past and present were strangely intertwined. Hours passed slowly as Chloe relived these fragments of memory. Some images returned vividly, moments from a childhood that suddenly seemed to have an inexplicable emptiness. She tried to push these thoughts away, rationalizing that it was all just a product of fatigue and stress. But the more she tried to ignore them, the more those memories became insistent, gaining a weight they hadn't had before. It was as if something hidden was trying to reveal itself. Finally, a nurse came out of the room and called her so she could see the judge. Chloe stood up with a mix of relief and anxiety, her legs slightly shaky as she followed the nurse down the brightly lit corridor. Upon entering the room, she saw Hastings lying on the bed, still pale but conscious. His eyes opened slowly, fixing on her. Chloe felt a wave of emotions wash over her. That gaze carried an intensity that left her speechless. For a moment, they looked at each other in silence, as if time had stopped. There was something inexplicable about the connection between them, a silent exchange that conveyed a strange intimacy, as if they shared a history both were yet unaware of. Hastings lifted one hand slightly and Chloe, without understanding why, moved closer, feeling her heart race as she saw the confused yet profound expression on his face. Hastings' lips moved slowly, trying to form words. "You were there?" he murmured, his voice hoarse and weakened but carrying a tone that sounded to Chloe both like a question and a statement. Those words sounded like a key in her mind, unlocking even more intense memories. Chloe wasn't sure what he meant, but she felt a shiver run through her, as if part of her knew exactly what he was talking about. The nurse came closer to check the judge's vitals, but neither Chloe nor Hastings looked away. That exchange of glances was almost magnetic, and the young lawyer felt that something much bigger was about to be revealed. Amid the exhaustion and tension, Hastings seemed to sense what she was feeling and gave her a small nod, an almost imperceptible gesture but one that conveyed silent acceptance, as if he, too, anticipated the closeness of a hidden truth. As the minutes passed, Chloe remained by the judge's bedside, trying to process the confusing emotions that surfaced. She felt, at the same time, vulnerable and curious, as if she had just opened a door to a new reality. And unexpectedly, she realized that this man, someone she had always admired from afar, might be the missing piece of a puzzle she had been trying to solve since childhood. Hastings' gaze, still fixed on hers, revealed an unusual depth, as if each second of that exchange carried a lifetime of emotions. Chloe felt a wave of emotion overtake her, an inexplicable certainty that there was something between them, something that, in some way, had always been there. And upon realizing this, she knew that from then on, nothing would be the same. Chloe spent long hours at the hospital, torn between fragmented memories and concern for the judge's health. With each visit, the doctors arrived accompanied by folders full of tests and documents. Hastings was undergoing a series of rigorous tests to understand the cause of his collapse. Chloe watched the specialists come and go, but something about the whispered conversations among them piqued her curiosity. There were details about Hastings' condition that seemed to involve more than routine medical exams. During one of her visits to the judge's room, a doctor stopped upon seeing her and asked her to wait in the hallway. "We need to discuss some points that arose during Mr. Hastings' condition analysis," he said with a thoughtful expression. Chloe nodded, feeling the weight of that unexpected conversation. She followed the doctor into a small meeting room nearby, where some members of the medical team were already waiting, bringing with them a silence loaded with expectation and mystery. As she sat down, Chloe noticed a pile of documents on the table. It was a set of detailed records about the judge's health, but as she looked closer, she realized there were also personal and old records, documents that didn't seem to belong to a simple medical history. There was, for example, a blood record and documents that referred to close relatives. She looked up at the doctor, who seemed to hesitate before continuing, as if treading on delicate ground. "During the tests, we found some details that led us to investigate further," the doctor began, choosing his words carefully. Chloe felt her heart speed up. His cautious tone seemed to indicate that this was more than just a routine medical consultation. The young lawyer, always analytical and perceptive, knew how to recognize when something was being concealed. She suddenly felt like an investigator, ready to unravel a mystery, though she had no idea that the unfolding case was, in fact, her own. "There is some information here," the doctor continued, pointing to the documents, "that suggests a possible familial connection." Chloe was stunned, her eyes widening slightly as she processed what he had just said. Family connection? The words echoed in her mind like an urgent, yet disturbing riddle. She tried to maintain her composure, but curiosity began to transform into anxiety, creating a tension she could no longer control. One of the doctors watched her closely, as if trying to gauge her reaction before proceeding. "This information is related to blood type and some specific genetic markers," he explained, while another doctor flipped through the pages of the records. Chloe, still not fully understanding what this meant, felt the mystery intensify. It was as if she were being led to a truth she never imagined seeking, but which now seemed somehow inevitable. As the doctors detailed their findings, Chloe tried to reorganize the fragments of memory that had haunted her since the incident in the courtroom. An unease grew in her chest, as if each word they spoke brought her closer to something immense and surprising. Something profound seemed about to be unveiled, something that might change everything she believed she knew about her life. Chloe took a deep breath, trying to prepare herself for a revelation that, somehow, already seemed to have been waiting for her for a long time. Finally, the doctor paused, looking directly at her before continuing. "Chloe, the information we found indicates that Mr. Hastings may have a connection with you that is not just professional." The words hung in the air, each one loaded with a gravity that left Chloe in complete silence. The connection she had started to feel with the judge, those inexplicable looks, everything seemed to align, forming an unexpected path toward the truth. Chloe felt a mixture of anticipation and fear. Part of her wanted to understand what was happening, while another part feared the answers. She couldn't take her eyes off the documents, but she knew that the truth would come with force, toppling old certainties and transforming her life forever. In her heart, the young lawyer prepared herself to hear something that she never imagined possible, even in her wildest dreams. The silence in the small meeting room felt deafening after the doctor's revelation. Chloe stared at the documents in front of her, but their words echoed in her mind like thunder. Judge Richard Hastings, that austere and admirable man, was her biological father. The news hit her like a wave, sweeping away every certainty she had about her life and the figure he represented to her until now. The ground beneath her feet seemed to disappear, leaving her adrift between surprise and disbelief. She recalled the moments in the courtroom, the intensity of the looks they exchanged, and the inexplicable connection she felt from the beginning. Chloe had always prided herself on her independence and the life she had built, but now, suddenly, she discovered a part of herself that had been missing all this time, hidden in the figure of a father she had never known. She felt vulnerable, as if exposed to a pain she never knew existed, but which now surfaced with overwhelming intensity. Confusion and anger began to mix in her heart, bringing a dull ache that made her close her eyes for a moment, trying to control the torrent of emotions. Questions began to form in her mind. Why had he never looked for her? What had prevented him from being in her life? But at the same time, a wave of sadness washed over her, as if something inside her broke upon realizing that he had been there, so close all along without her ever suspecting. Chloe tried to take a deep breath, but each inhalation felt heavy. She remembered moments from her childhood, the days when she felt the absence of a paternal figure, her mother who never spoke clearly about the past, always changing the subject when she asked about her father. Now, that distant and mysterious figure had a concrete face, and this revelation brought a mixture of relief and bitterness. It was as if each fragment of her life was being rearranged, revealing a bigger picture she had never imagined. Her eyes, once filled with surprise, began to blur with tears, which she quickly tried to hold back. The doctor's voices sounded distant now. Chloe felt alone amid the chaos of her feelings. She didn't know whether to laugh, cry, or simply question everything she had always believed. Her body trembled slightly, and the reality of having a father who had been there, so close yet so inaccessible, surrounded her in a whirlwind of emotions. Looking at the documents, she saw details that confirmed the truth, but part of her heart still resisted, trying to deny the obvious. How could he be her father and never say anything? How could he watch her from afar without ever approaching? This truth, so unexpected, seemed to carry with it a weight of pain and sacrifice that she could not understand. The memories of the intense looks they exchanged in the hospital now made sense, but it only made the situation even more painful. Chloe rose slowly, feeling a desperate need to confront him, to understand the full truth. But deep down, part of her hesitated, fearing the answers that might come. She felt torn between the impulse to go to him and demand an explanation and the desire to flee, to protect herself from the pain this new reality might bring. Every step she took was like an internal struggle as she tried to handle the waves of emotion that seemed intent on overwhelming her. Her thoughts turned to Hastings, or rather to her father, and she wondered what he was feeling now, if he knew that the secret had been discovered. Was he regretful? Had he, at some point, wanted to reveal the truth? Chloe couldn't prevent a tear from escaping, a reflection of the pain and frustration struggling to emerge. The image of the man she admired began to dissolve, revealing someone more human and flawed, yet someone who was inevitably part of her. Finally, she left the meeting room with a new resolution. She didn't yet know what she would say to Hastings when she saw him, nor if she would find the right words, but she knew she needed to confront him, to understand why he had kept his distance all these years. Chloe entered the hospital room, feeling the weight of each step, as if she were about to cross an invisible door into a past she never knew. Richard Hastings lay on the bed, his eyes fixed on the ceiling, his expression marked by a mixture of pain and exhaustion. Upon noticing her presence, he slowly turned his head, his eyes carrying a vulnerability that Chloe had never imagined seeing in that man. The silence between them was dense, laden with unspoken words and unanswered questions. Chloe took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm of emotions swirling in her chest. "Why did you never tell me?" Her voice came out almost as a whisper, a question that held not only anger and sadness but also a desperate desire for an explanation. Richard looked away for a moment, as if the words he was about to say required a strength he could barely summon. "I thought it would be better this way," he replied, his voice weak but filled with a painful sincerity. She closed her eyes for a moment, fighting against the sense of abandonment growing within her. Better for whom, Richard? Better for you or for me? The question hung in the air like an echo, and she felt a pang of sadness as she referred to him by name and not as her father. He kept his gaze down, visibly marked by guilt, and finally began to speak, as if opening old wounds that had remained buried for years. "I was young, Chloe," he began, his voice low, almost trembling. "And your mother and I, we had an intense but complicated relationship. When she decided to go on with you alone, she thought it would be best for all of us." He paused, taking a deep breath as if the memory still haunted him. "I wanted to be part of your life, but your mother, she believed I wasn't ready for that responsibility. And maybe she was right." Chloe felt her anger mix with an unexpected compassion as she listened to Richard's confession. He wasn't the impenetrable man she had imagined, but a human being who, like her, had faced loss and painful choices. "And even after all these years, after you became a judge, you never tried to find me?" Her voice cracked slightly, but she kept her posture firm, waiting for an answer that would justify his silence. Richard closed his eyes as if reliving each of those years in a single instant. I tried a few times," he admitted with a deep regret in his voice. "But I always feared that you wouldn't accept me, that my presence would cause more harm than good. And then time passed, and the distance between us only grew." He looked at her, his eyes brimming with tears, and Chloe felt the weight of each word, each sacrifice he had made, even though these decisions had hurt her so deeply. She wanted to feel anger, to blame Richard for all the years she had spent without a father, but there, in front of that fragile and regretful man, she discovered her feelings were more complex. There was a part of her that understood his burden, that saw the sacrifice in the nuances of his story. Richard extended his hand slightly as if hoping for a connection, and Chloe, hesitating, took it, feeling the warmth she had never known she so desired. Their touch was light but laden with a deep history finally surfacing. "Chloe, I'm sorry for everything. I know I can't change what I did or didn't do, but if there's any way to start over..." His voice broke, but he kept his gaze steady, as if offering her everything left of his soul. Chloe closed her eyes for a moment, absorbing those words, feeling the weight of reconciliation and forgiveness beginning to blossom within her. With a lump in her throat, she took a deep breath and opened her eyes, meeting Richard's gaze with renewed intensity. There were no easy answers nor guarantees for the future, but there, in that hospital room, they were finally meeting as father and daughter. The hours following the conversation with Richard were an emotional roller coaster for Chloe. She wandered through the hospital corridor, her mind trapped between the relief of finally having answers and the pain of a late truth. Everything seemed suspended, as if her life had been interrupted and she didn't quite know how to proceed. Her lonely childhood, the absent father figure, everything took on new meaning, but this understanding also brought a weight she hadn't expected to carry. Chloe felt torn, as if part of her wanted to flee from this newly discovered bond, while another clung to the chance of finally having a father. How could she accept someone who, even while being so close, had chosen not to be part of her life? At the same time, there was a part of her that longed for this connection, a desire repressed for years that was now coming to the surface. This dilemma consumed her, and she feared that any choice she made would leave an irreparable hurt behind. The sense of justice that had always guided her life now seemed to conflict with her emotions. As a lawyer, Chloe had always believed in truth and in taking responsibility for one's actions, and she felt that, somehow, this also applied to her now. Richard, despite all his mistakes, was reaching out, seeking a fresh start. She realized that, like him, she would have to decide whether she was willing to face the weight of this new reality, with all its contradictions. Reflecting on all this, Chloe felt that her relationship with Richard would require more than forgiveness. It would require courage. It was a new kind of responsibility that came with the title of daughter, something she had never felt before. If she accepted, she would have to let go of part of the anger she had held onto for so many years, and this was as difficult as forgiveness itself. This understanding began to seep into her, slowly but deeply, like a commitment taking shape within her soul. She recalled the moment she held his hand in the room, a gesture that, though brief, carried the possibility of something new. Accepting Richard as her father meant opening herself up to the unknown, to memories that hadn't yet been created, to stories that could still be told. But it was also a risky bet, for if he disappointed her again, the pain might be even more intense than before. Chloe felt herself teetering on the edge between hope and fear. Behind this dilemma, a new sense of identity began to form. She was no longer just the determined and self-sufficient lawyer. She was now someone with roots that, though confused, connected her to a past she had always imagined empty. This brought a new perspective on who she was and, more importantly, who she could become. Chloe realized that accepting Richard could bring forth values and stories that would define her in a completely new way. At the same time, she knew this decision didn't have to be made immediately. She could allow time to shape the space between them, revealing little by little who Richard Hastings was beyond the stern judge everyone knew. Perhaps, she thought, allowing herself to know his human side, the side she so longed to understand, was the key to finding her own peace. With this possibility in mind, the weight of the situation seemed to become a little more bearable. Still, Chloe couldn't ignore the echo of hurt in her chest. There was a part of her that insisted on remembering the years of silence, the moments when she had to rely on herself without any support. This part made her hesitate, wondering if she should really give him a second chance. But she knew that by closing this door now, she might be depriving herself of something rare and precious, something that could change her life forever. Finally, Chloe took a deep breath, feeling a mix of strength and vulnerability grow within her. She decided that, no matter how difficult it might be, she would try to understand the man Richard truly was, beyond the image of the judge. The first conversations between Chloe and Richard were marked by a strange blend of caution and curiosity. In the hospital, he was still recovering from his collapse, and she visited him often, carrying with her a mix of questions and silences. Sitting by his bed, Chloe observed him, noticing details that had previously gone unnoticed. The way he furrowed his brow when he thought, the way his fingers rested on the sheets, as if he were still accustomed to holding a judge's gavel. Small marks of a man who, until then, had been a distant figure in her life. One night, when the hospital was silent, Chloe found him awake, looking out the window with a distant expression. She sat beside him, hesitant, until he broke the silence. "Sometimes I wonder what it would have been like if I had made different decisions," he confessed, his voice low and reflective. The words hung between them like a confession, an open door to a past he seemed to carry with regret. Chloe remained silent, absorbing that unexpected vulnerability and feeling closer to him than she ever imagined. Gradually, these moments became a routine. Chloe began to ask questions, and Richard, with sincerity, shared pieces of his life that she had never known. He spoke about his youth, the ambitions that led him to a career as a judge, and the sacrifices that choice demanded. Chloe listened attentively, realizing that behind the rigid image was a man who, like everyone else, carried his own battles and regrets. For the first time, she saw beyond the figure of the judge and glimpsed the man who, unbeknownst to her, had always been part of her story. The conversations moved to memories of Chloe's childhood, moments she had shared with her mother and had never had anyone to share them with before. She spoke about the challenges of growing up without a father and how she learned to become strong on her own. Richard listened in silence, his eyes wet with tears, perhaps understanding for the first time the impact of his absence. Chloe did not hide the pain she carried, but at the same time she felt comforted by his attentive listening, as if she could finally share her story with someone who truly cared. One night, he surprised her with an unexpected question. "What made you choose law, Chloe?" She remained silent for a moment, searching for words to explain the motivation she had always kept deep within her. "I believe in the truth," she replied, her voice firm. "I wanted to be a lawyer so that no one would go through what I went through, to give a voice to those who have none." Richard smiled, proud and moved, as if seeing a reflection of himself in her determination. From then on, their mutual admiration grew, solidifying a bond that now seemed unbreakable. Over time, they began to share dreams and values, discovering that, despite their different paths, they had common ground. Richard started to see in Chloe the continuation of his own fight for justice, while she found in him a mentor and friend, someone who understood the responsibilities and dilemmas of her profession. This silent understanding created a special bond, a sense of belonging that both of them, on some level, had always longed for. In the following months, their meetings became more frequent and lighter. They laughed together, shared funny stories about their respective jobs, and Chloe noticed with surprise the sense of peace these moments brought her. The empty space in her heart was beginning to fill, and she realized that, no matter how late, this reconciliation offered a kind of healing she hadn't known she needed. It was as if she could finally lay down the armor she had always worn. Richard, for his part, was transforming before her eyes. He was no longer the stern and distant judge, but a father who, although imperfect, was there, willing to build a story with her. The nights of conversation became a ritual between them, and Chloe, leaving the hospital, felt increasingly at peace with the choices she had made. This recent bond was growing stronger, and what had once been a relationship based on absence was now becoming an alliance between two people who shared deep respect and admiration. In one of these conversations, Richard confided in Chloe how much she had inspired him, even without knowing it. "I became a better man because you existed, Chloe," he admitted, his voice choked. And those words remained etched in her heart, like a silent promise that, together, they could turn what was left of the past into a future they could both build, side by side. The invitation came on an ordinary afternoon, as Chloe was in her office reviewing a complex case. She received a formal phone call informing her that her experience and ethical stance made her an ideal candidate for a position on the Legal Ethics Council. The surprise left her speechless for a few seconds, and as she recovered, she felt her heart race. It was a unique opportunity, an honor that represented recognition not only of her career but of the values she had always defended. And now, with her recent closeness to her father, the opportunity seemed to carry even deeper significance. When she shared the news with Richard, she saw his face light up with genuine pride, something that touched her deeply. He smiled, placing a hand on her shoulder, his gaze emotional. "I always knew you had a great path ahead," he said with a soft tone. His recognition and support gave her a new confidence, as if for the first time, she felt the weight of a responsibility that, while immense, she didn't have to carry alone. For the first time, father and daughter would be part of something together, and this filled every cell in Chloe with a quiet joy. Taking a seat beside Richard on the council meant joining their paths in a shared purpose, something they had both always valued, the integrity of justice. Chloe, with her young and determined outlook, and Richard, with his experience and wisdom, now represented a unique pair. She felt it wasn't merely a professional choice, but a way of restoring the ties that time had broken, turning their relationship into a force for the greater good. The first meetings were intense, and Chloe found herself learning more from Richard each day. He guided her, but always respected her point of view, valuing the ethics and empathy she brought to each discussion. Gradually, he stopped being just the respected judge and became a close mentor, and Chloe felt genuine admiration for him grow in her heart. Working alongside her father was not just a challenge, it was an opportunity to get to know his essence, the principles he had defended throughout his life. For the other council members, the presence of Chloe and Richard together was inspiring. They saw a new generation united with tradition, as if the past and future of justice sat side by side at the same table. The heated discussions and complex cases they faced revealed the synergy between them. Chloe realized that, alongside Richard, she found the strength to confront dilemmas she would have once faced with trepidation. Together, they were a powerful voice against injustices and an example of integrity for all other professionals. One afternoon, after a long meeting, Chloe and Richard sat together in his office, a space adorned with books and notes from a career devoted to law. She observed the shelves filled with memories and trophies from past legal battles, feeling deeply connected to that history. "One day all this will also be your legacy, Chloe," he said with a slight smile. Those words warmed her heart, She knew that she was not only honoring her own journey but also continuing a commitment her father had always had to the truth. After a few weeks, Chloe's name was already spoken with respect among the council members. Her firm yet fair stance and her dedication to ethics made it clear that she was born for this role. She felt that, alongside Richard, she was building something greater than a career. She was creating a bridge between past and future, a legacy of values that they both would share and uphold. His presence by her side strengthened every decision, and Chloe, for the first time, saw the future with a newfound and invigorating certainty. Working together, father and daughter began to make plans to improve the council's performance, discussing ways they could strengthen public transparency and trust in the legal system. Chloe suggested bold ideas, some of which made Richard smile as he listened, though he agreed with her. He respected the courage and passion she displayed, and every advance they achieved together seemed to reinforce the bond that time had returned to them. Deep down, Chloe knew that none of this would have been possible without the challenges they faced. Her new professional destiny was not just a personal achievement but a symbol of redemption, a sign that even after years of silence and distance, there was always a chance to start over. The large courtroom was packed that morning with lawyers, judges, and members of the legal community filling every available seat. The buzz quieted when Richard Hastings entered, his imposing figure exuding the same authority as always, though there was something different in his expression. Chloe, at his side, looked at him with a restrained expression of emotion, knowing this would be a defining moment for them both. She took a deep breath, feeling a mix of nervousness and pride. Richard positioned himself in the center of the courtroom, and the audience watched him expectantly. He cleared his throat before beginning, and the silence became absolute. "Today I am not here as a judge, but as a man, as a father," he began, his voice slightly choked. "I am here to recognize someone who, although not present in my life from the start, has always been part of me, of my journey, and of who I am." His shining eyes found Chloe's, who looked at him with a mix of surprise and admiration. Chloe felt Richard's words resonate deeply in her heart. He continued, now with a softer, almost intimate tone. "A few months ago I reconnected with a daughter, a woman whose courage, integrity, and determination have not only moved me but taught me. Chloe Reynolds is not only my colleague, my partner on the council. She is my daughter." A gasp of surprise echoed among those present, and the looks of admiration now turned to Chloe, who remained at his side, visibly emotional. Chloe's eyes filled with tears, but she maintained a firm posture, drawing strength from Richard. She felt his words finally closing an old wound, as if each word was a balm, sealing a past of absence with a present of reconciliation. People around seemed to grasp the depth of the moment, and many looked at the two of them with a sense of emotion. That moment transcended the formality of the courtroom. It was an act of redemption and reunion that everyone there could understand. After a brief silence, the audience began to applaud, and the sound echoed through the courtroom walls, transforming that space into something new, filled with emotions and memories. Richard smiled at Chloe, a smile that conveyed pride, respect, and love, feelings she had always dreamed of seeing on his face. She smiled back, feeling complete at last. The applause grew, and Chloe realized that this was a new form of recognition, one that time and truth had built together. After the ceremony, father and daughter walked together down the main hall of the courthouse, side by side, in silence yet fully connected. It was as if that walk symbolized the entire journey they had faced to arrive there, a journey of pain, absence, discovery, and finally love. Chloe held Richard's arm, feeling a security that, for the first time, did not come solely from herself but from the renewed bond with her father. To her, that courthouse was no longer just a workplace but the stage where her heart and life had been rebuilt. As they exited the building, Chloe looked out over the city stretching before them. She knew that from this moment on, everything would be different, but she now carried within herself the strength of a transformed story. Richard turned to her, with pride shining in his eyes, and said, "This is only the first victory we have won together, Chloe." She nodded, feeling the weight and beauty of that moment, which marked not only the end of a personal quest but the beginning of a new chapter. The past had left scars, but it had also built a foundation upon which father and daughter could now lean. Chloe felt a peace she had never known, a certainty that, despite mistakes and failures, love and truth have the power to heal and renew. Their story, once marked by separations, was now a testament to forgiveness and redemption. As they walked, the sunlight seemed brighter, as if illuminating the journey that, however late, was finally coming to fruition. Chloe and Richard walked on together, ready to face the future with the strength and unity they had gained. And so, without the need for further words, They closed a chapter that, despite all adversities, found its conclusion in understanding and love. If you enjoyed the incredible story of Chloe and Richard, subscribe to our channel and activate notifications so you won't miss any of our upcoming videos. If you love touching stories and want to support our channel to continue bringing more quality content, consider contributing through Buy Me a Coffee. The link is in the first pinned comment. Your support is essential for us to keep improving. Thank you for your support. Until the next moving story.